I know it sounds crazy, but what if architecture stopped becoming a service-based industry and started becoming a product-based industry? What
Hmm.
does that even mean? So instead of clients hiring the services of an architecture firm to design their custom-made million-dollar homes, what if architects produced well-designed, off-the-shelf floor plans as a product for clients to buy and build their homes at a much more accessible price? So I was inspired to make this episode, long story short, from listening to an episode of the Business of Architecture podcast, specifically episode 9. And in that episode, they talked exactly what I was just explaining before. But what if architecture, as it is a very service oriented industry, and what if that became a product oriented industry, similar to how home builder companies work? So, for a long time now, architects have believed, as well as us being taught this in studio, that architecture needs to be this site specific and uniquely designed to the programmatic needs of clients and offer our services as designers to accomplish this. However, that mindset, according to the episode, has landed architects for being responsible for, get this, only 3% of all housing stock built in the United States. Meaning, for those of you doing math at home, 97% of houses are built from non architecture firm designed drawings.
That is
That's
crazy.
crazy. Yeah. So, this made me think, and I want to get your guys' opinions at home and Albert's thoughts on this. But quick disclaimer, we're not coming to the plate here fully loaded with facts and statistics. Rather, we're simply just trying to have a discussion on the topic and reacting to these ideas. So if you yourself would like to go deeper and research and verify these facts for yourself, like, we totally highly encourage it, but that's not the point for this specific episode. We simply just want to make you guys think a little bit differently and come to your own conclusions and let us know what you think about the topic by the end of the episode. So with that out of the way, let's talk about if there actually are some compelling reasons for architecture as an industry to shift from a service-based industry to a product-based industry. So find your own floor plans, open up an online store, and let's get into it. All right, so we are doing just a little bit of setup for this episode, and we kind of come up with 3 main directions that we wanted to talk about with this argument. So we're just going to start with the first direction, and we'll get through all 3 of it as it goes. But before we get into that, we also just wanted to talk about a couple like bigger points of like preliminary questions, I guess you could say. So we're kind of all on the same page before we even really dive into this episode.
Mhm.
So first thing, right, is why is it so common to think of architecture as site specific and like, client program requirement dependent design instead of more of like a generalized solution where like, surely not every project in the world needs to respond to every single site context perfectly to be effective or have like a unique and client specific program requirements, right? Like how many skyscrapers downtown have the same dimensions, and like you would hardly have an argument to say like, oh, that's site specific or something.
Right.
Bigger picture. If you go to the smaller micro details, sure, you can have a lot better arguments in that case. But again, we're just trying to explore all angles. So I was curious what your thoughts on that were.
Right. I think, well, in school, right, there, like, you do projects like with ours, the domestic violence co-housing, the jazz club, basically a lot of these different types of I can definitely see that with residential components of like designs, right? Like, you don't necessarily need to be super site specific in the way that you're approaching the design, but with projects like that are more culturally based or more understanding of where people are coming from, that needs to be super super specific, because in the end I think it's about the respecting those people and then the building itself and where it sits.
Yeah, because this is a very interesting question, because I mean, we've said on many episodes before that yes, your building should be very site specific and follow certain context and everything else. But I think something that's been missing in that question for a while is, what does that exactly mean to be site specific? I've heard many arguments in the past from different professors where they're like, oh, if you literally pick up the building and throw it in some other country, does it fit or does it feel like it's out of place? And that also is kind of like a weird argument, because with like international style, that kind of seems like it's out the window nowadays, where there's a glass box skyscraper in every single city. And if you would argue the fact that that's probably the most prominent buildings of all cities are these glass boxes or whatever. But even when it comes to houses and stuff, like, when you're going to very specific culturally significant movie fashion or just like
Yeah.
pop culture reference fashion, along the coast, you'll see California style homes. If you go over to New York City, you'll have a very different look of housing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go into the Midwest, you also have like that Midwest home look. But if
Yeah.
you go to Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, all those look like they have the exact same home designs,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
what does that mean to be site specific,
Yeah.
If you're in a neighborhood and your plot is the exact same as the one across the street from you, is that something that you're supposed to be site specific about, or is that something where again you can take a more general approach? Because
That,
that's what we see a lot in these I guess neighborhood developments, right? The
yeah.
developers usually just take like 5 house plans or
Mm-hmm.
something and just like roll the dice, throw random assortment around a cul-de-sac and say that's good enough, next one.
Yeah. Well, I think it really goes back to the thing that you were saying with the 3% versus the 97%, Ryan, with 97 being like non-architecture firm based design. And
Mhm.
so whenever we try to, at least in the design school and architecture school, a lot of the connections we are creating is one by the people of that city, and two with the most culturally relevant buildings around the area, right? Because like you said, if 97% are like more of the non-architectural firm based design, why should we base the design of the specific site, the specific project that we're doing based on that 97% rather than the ones that are more for the city? So like where we live in, I don't know, for where we lived in Kansas, United States, the main where we lived was the school, the Kansas State University. But aside from
Mhm.
that, every single house was kind of generic,
Yeah.
very like developer heavy based design. But when you're designing on a space in Kansas like that, would you ever go back to like, hey, I'm gonna base my design based on these houses that are developer heavy? Or would you rather go to, oh, I like the materials of the Kansas State University where limestone was such a big part of their material choice, right? It's like,
Yeah. So you're kind of saying if the context around you is crappy, then why not just pull from the good context?
yeah, exactly, kind of like that. Yeah, a little bit like that. But that's also the more quote unquote grandiose part of architecture, that you just want to have nice things, and so
Hmm.
you try to get back from those, you try to steal from the nicer things within that city.
Well, because this is one of the other like preliminary questions I was thinking about when putting this outline together. But the what is the purpose of architecture? Not to get like super philosophical or whatever, but
Hmm.
it's like is the point of architecture and like an architect's mission is that to make sure that everyone in the world has access to great design?
Mm. That's actually a really good point because
Is that what the quote unquote big picture mission is?
right,
Otherwise, what is it? Is it to be more on a selfish basis of like, oh, I have these skills and as a designer I know how to do houses, so I'm just going to design houses for people for
right,
money. Like that doesn't quite seem right either.
right.
So
I think
if it is that,
the result of why architects go into architecture and design buildings is because they're designing for activities to happen.
or just like designing for a better world. Like I feel like I've seen that on most people's like
Yeah,
portfolios or resumes. Their mission statement at the beginning is like,
yeah,
I want to make my designs make the world better, like positively impact communities and stuff. Like I
yeah.
think like that's like everyone's shared goal, shared mission, if you will. So
Hmm.
if that is true, like let's
Hmm.
assume like that is the purpose of architecture, right? This also opens up to the argument of if the goal is to have great design accessible to the most amount of people possible, wouldn't it actually be a lot more aligned with our goal to make these product based industry moves? Like offer really well designed floor plans
Hmm.
to these people so they can buy the floor plan in the plans or the drawing set to build these really good houses instead of going to buy these developer made houses and everything else,
Hmm.
right? Because now your mission is much more affordable. It's
Yeah,
something that people can easily access. You can just buy it online and like have it printed out there,
yeah.
or whatever. So it removes the barriers. The point, you don't have to be a billionaire to now have to walk into a firm to then hire them for their services
Hmm.
to do a custom made house when you're just building in a neighborhood that doesn't have the needs for a custom
Mm-hmm.
site context specific environmental, analytic.
Yeah. It
And you
remi-
can just get a good designed house.
yeah. It reminds me a lot of, when the iPhones were coming out. Only the rich people were getting the iPhones, and then all the plebes like us were just, we had the normal phones. I didn't have a
Still in the
phone, but
blueberries and the
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, like those. And then
The Nokia.
as they tried to innovate that like specific phone and make it more advanced, then they started to release these things to the public and make it more accessible. But I really like the idea of like giving accessibility to the people and making architecture more affordable with great
Because that's just
designs.
like where my head was at with this. That's ultimately why I wanted to make this episode, because it seems like we've been looking in one direction this whole time, it seems, where it's just been, oh, architecture is just, that's how it works. People who with a lot of money come to architects to get their house designed to their specific needs, and that's just how it works. But
Mhm.
then it's like, but doesn't that kind of go against what we've been taught in studio and what we think architecture is? And then we get kind of disappointed when you get to the industry and realize, oh, I'm actually really not helping a lot of the people I thought I was going to help. I'm kind of just contributing to billionaires' projects and stuff who already have like 3 houses. They just want one for a summer getaway. And
Yep.
like, well, that wasn't really what I thought I was doing. I was kind of hoping I could help the homeless, but it's all right. I guess $1 billion house is cool too.
You're like, the homeless people can't buy my stuff anymore. It's too expensive. What the end goal is, I want to make architecture great again, but to do that, I need to like,
Yeah.
I need money, and apparently homeless people don't have money, and that's just like, architecture is. We have such a really great goal of making it universal, but then it doesn't really apply in the real world, right?
Yeah.
That's what sucks about it.
So yeah, with some of those preliminary things out the way, I wanted to start talking about the first general direction of the conversation. For the general public to have greater accessibility to great architecture and design, we had to basically meet the people where their budget is and like directly compete with whatever the status quo is, which is the home builders, right? These home
Mm-hmm.
builders and developers, the ones who create these neighborhoods of like 100 something plus houses and everything that
Mm-hmm.
copy and paste the same 5 floor plans over and over again, right?
Yeah.
So if that is the 97% of housing out there, how do architects get into that scene? How do we meet the people at their budget and help them afford quote unquote better designed houses than the ones that are on the markets and everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like is the direction really then for greater accessibility to offer these off the shelf floor plan designs from maybe some of these prestigious firms,
Mm-hmm.
Would it make sense for a lot of these firms to on their websites start to just offer like a shopping section, I guess, where you can scroll through and buy your housing model, click the bedrooms, get the bedrooms, and then figure out, I kind of want it in like a modern style, kind of want like this type of exterior, and then hit add to cart and buy it.
What worries about me, like about that for me though, is as designers, as people who are working for these clients with service, how
Hmm.
do we make sure that we are getting the money? How do we make sure that we are sustaining ourselves so that we can actually pay for food, our homes, and stuff like that? Because if we start to sell architecture things as like, if you sell floor plans for $100, how does that become sustainable for us?
Right. Because, yeah, I've heard from other people that I think it's a pretty well known fact that most architecture firms tend to charge clients about 10% or 15% of the total construction cost of whatever building that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So if the house itself, right, is $3 million to build for this client, usually architects can grab about $30 to $45,000 on top of that for their office. So they can keep
Mm-hmm.
the lights on, pay their employees and whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a frugal business in that sense too, because especially for residential architecture, there can be a lot of like floods of projects coming in that keep your office pretty well budgeted and everything
Mm-hmm.
else. And there can be lots of drought where all of a sudden Now you have nobody wanting to build homes, and you're having to use that set budget or like that, fee on top of it to help sustain you until you can get the next project. So if you're talking in the realms of like 30K to 50K per project or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially like a one person salary if you really
Yeah.
think about it. So then
Yeah.
how do you, yeah, like what you're talking about, like how do you
How
do
do you
that
make?
with $100 floor plans or something? Like,
Yeah.
is it really more of like you start to charge, I don't know, $1,000 or something? Or like, what is that the realm? Or like, what
What
does
I've
it
been
work like that?
hearing recently, or like so I was doing the research. I found out that you know how with architecture firms they have billings, right? Like they have a set amount of budget for concept phase, that amount of amount of
Hmm.
money for schematics, the design development, all these different things. But what I figured out some with from the research was that some firms out there are actually they have it where to do the concept phase, it costs this much. That's like there is no more billings of how much hours you worked on it. It's just this set amount from there, and then you move on to schematic, and then this is the set amount, and so it becomes like this. They're productizing their service. So instead of it being like I worked on this for 10 hours for the specific floor plan, now it's just this is how much it cost.
Mm. So is it kind of like, let's pretend like it took you 10 hours to draw up a floor plan then, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you
Yeah.
would just say like whatever your hourly rate is,
Mm-hmm.
you would just charge that times 10 hours and say that's what the floor plan costs.
Yes, because you have these are all generic floor plans already that you've created, and since you created that generic floor plan within that 10 hours that you did to service that, that 10 hours would then just be the
Multiplied, however many people buy it then.
yep exactly, and so that's how I understood the articles of some it's like what some firms are doing, but there are some firms out there that are trying to productize architecture basically very much like a car dealership with like what you were saying
Hmm.
last night where when you go in a car dealership you're like I want to customize this, I want to have red seats, leather seats.
Sport mode with a turbo on it, and I want these kind of rims. And then you go to add to cart, and you're like, cool, we'll ship it to you in 2 weeks or whatever it is.
Yeah, and
And
so
then boom, now you
architecture.
got your custom made home or custom made car showed up on
Yeah.
your driveway in a few weeks or so.
Yeah, and some architecture firms are shifting that direction, but I just don't know how they are trying to like make it super sustainable for the designers themselves, right?
Because maybe I can't imagine that the industry can completely shift.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd become more of like a supplementation to every architecture firm, essentially, where yes, you're still doing your customized service based work for these bigger clients who have very specific needs to very specific sites and whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think it just makes sense to for every single firm to move in that direction where they now begin to offer I mean I was joking at it before, but literally just have like a shop Zaha Hadid click on it and then you can see like 6 different models of homes to buy, say I want that one, and then now you can say that you have an ownership of a Zaha Hadid house, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like it just I that's why I was saying like last night about the whole car dealership thing where it's like the more I'm really thinking about it, it just starts to make more sense at
Mm-hmm.
what the mission is for most architects and architecture students graduating nowadays, where it's
Right.
yes, we want to impact the world, we want to give to the people who need it the most, and blah 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to get paid for your services. Well, how do you do that? I think that's a pretty decent
Mm-hmm.
outline of like looking at those things.
Having
And
both sides.
yeah, I was gonna say, and before you get all up in arms about this, say like this is impossible, this will never happen. It's already been happening. It's
Yeah.
it's a thing. It exists today. It's existed 100 plus years ago. Believe it or not, Sears. You remember Sears, like the Willis Howard, like that Sears company,
Yeah.
the one that did clothes, the one that did like kitchen stuff, all that. They also sold homes in catalogs, and I'll throw up an image of that right now too. And those existed all the way since the 1900s, not
Dude,
1950,
that's crazy.
1900s. So you can literally look in a catalog while you're looking at your sweaters to buy for your niece. And you're like going over to buy a different pan, and then you can
Mm-hmm.
flip to the next page. And it's like, oh, which house would you like for $14,000? You're like,
Yeah.
I'll call. I like that one. So I'll call the number and get it set up. Like
Oh
these things
man.
have existed. And I'm not sure if that was ran by architecture firms. I kind of doubt it.
Yeah.
But it's just to
Sounds like
think about like,
developer
yeah. So then,
developer
okay.
projects.
So I don't know if we really have anything else to touch on for like that first direction, but that really ties into the second direction, right? So this one's a little bit more like a doomsday kind of depresso espresso kind of mentality. But is the architecture industry in threat of losing out on the residential market, right?
Mm.
Because as we said earlier in the episode, and again, these are my numbers, this is pulled from the episode, but they were saying if it is true that 97% of the housing stock across the United States is done by these draftsmen and like other home builder companies, then architects aren't even in that space to begin with, right?
Hmm.
And what might have made people think like, oh, well, you know, those are very generic designs. And of course, if you want something nicer, then you'll pay for the service of an architect to make it look nice or renovate it or
Hmm.
something like that.
Hmm.
However, let's not forget AI is now a thing. It is never going to go away, right? It's only going to become more apparent in every single business that you see from this point forward. And it's only going to get better. It's only going to get faster. It's only going to get more accessible to people. So, what
Hmm.
does that even mean? I mean, I can only speculate. I don't know much, but I can see a pretty clear line between how these current home builder companies, who essentially, like, for all intents and purposes, have a monopoly on the housing industry, can easily just adapt these AI tools to make their quote unquote generic looking houses look a billion times better, if not the same level as an architecture firm in not too far in the future,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they have the economy of scale because they do 97% of all the houses. So if they are quote unquote losing money by
Hmm.
spending extra designing certain things to look a certain way, they easily make that back from replicating it 16 times.
Right.
So it's kind of like I mean, truly, like, is architecture industry in threat of just completely losing the residential realm?
Yeah. And I think these luxurious homes being able to sell as like products, right? As that, it makes sense if all housing were kind of like that to the point where it's not just a McMansion thing, right? The things that you see on
Mm-hmm.
very
MTV
developer
cribs
heavies.
and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's a little bit more I don't know, aesthetic, more of like you're living inside an art instead of like you're
Hmm.
living inside a box, some type of thing, right?
Yeah.
And it makes more sense to go in that direction while also because develop I don't know, man, it's like developers really just care about money. It's in the end it's just about money. And so if we can make these products that we're trying to do as cheap as possible, developers will try to buy it as much as possible. And because these designs are super nice, residents will want them. And so then everyone's winning in some sort of capacity,
Yeah.
right?
So, because you're basically saying instead of the home builders pulling from their own office of designers,
Mm-hmm.
if architects came out and produced the floor plans, the
Mm-hmm.
developers would buy the rights to use those floor plans to then develop into these houses that people live in these neighborhoods with. Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. 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 And I think that it's not just like a single family too, but now what if we turn this idea and start going to like townhouses, the all these different residential buildings that we can live in and just make those generic but also well designed in that same regard.
Yeah.
So
Because I
developers will buy
think,
into it because it's cheap, but and then the residents will want to buy it because it's nice. And so
mhm.
we're not losing in. But it makes me wonder though, Ryan, that like if we are going to this product based design, right? How do we make sure as architects, as designers, that we are still getting the job?
Because that's the thing. This is what I've been scratching my head about since like the beginning of the year. Man, this AI, I was taking a class back in college that was called Exploring Creativity. And in that, they had us read this book. And I,
What
let
was the
me
book
flash it.
called?
I can't remember on the top of my head, and I'm really upset by that. I'll throw a picture on screen and I'll link it in the description once I find it again. But in the book, it was essentially explaining that if you choose to go into a creative field, then you should be safe from having your job taken over by robots and stuff.
Mm.
Because in the book, they were pointing out examples of like self checkout things because people are obviously saying like, "Oh, I'd rather not talk to a person. Let me just get my thing or get my things done quickly and just get out of the store." And then
Yeah.
people are starting to see things where like everything's starting to become more efficient, just like online delivery services, and people are wanting to do less and less things that require like human interaction and stuff. So then
Mm-hmm.
they were saying even further was like jobs that only deal with analytics stuff, like banking, like analytics, those kind of fields were super in jeopardy because obviously it doesn't take a lot of genius to understand that a computer can easily filter through numbers faster and with less errors than humans would for cheaper, if not free. So then
Yeah.
it's kind of like the, oh, well, good thing we chose architecture because there's no way computers can take over creative build. What? Sees Dali come into the scene, sees Midjourney come onto the scene. I'm like, why are we doing this part? Like, why can't we just have AI take over like laundry and stuff? Why are we trying to take over the fun things that humans are fundamentally, wanting to do?
Yeah.
So it comes to the point where it's like, yeah, like I honestly, it's like, what is keeping architecture safe? The only thing legally that's keeping architecture safe is working for larger construction projects, such as like office buildings and
Mm-hmm.
like stadiums and these bigger, massive projects. But actually, residential architecture is not even remotely protected for architects
Yeah.
because, as you can see, house builders, developers, contractors, they basically have free run to do whatever they want as long as it follows
Yeah.
city ordinances and everything else, or
Yeah.
and building
Yeah.
code. So if architects are not even protected in that sense, it's like that's what I mean. Are we really not even safe? Like, is
Yeah.
architecture under threat of losing out of the housing market forever? Because
I
it's
think
only a matter of time before these AI advancements allow these other house developers, home builder companies to
yeah.
just do what we do.
Yeah. I think at some point the government has to step in and say that, hey, architecture cannot be replaced with AI at some point, or like a specific part of the AI. And because, oh dude, that just sucks in terms of like we studied all these times and then all of a sudden
Yeah,
AI just steps in and be like, hey, I can do your job too. Not as good, but it's way cheaper.
exactly. And people are like, "Ooh, cheaper? You got me."
Yeah. And it's scary to think about, but
So
I don't
that's why
know.
I'm saying, in my opinion, that's why I think many architecture firms should explore that idea of allowing these quote unquote cheaper, more accessible products to be given out to prospective clients who obviously can't afford these $3 million projects to make something worth pursuing as an architecture firm. Because for context too, my first internship was working at a high-end residential firm, and they were
Mm,
explaining something too, where like even a budget of $1 million was borderline not even worth pursuing because they couldn't turn a profit from that.
mm,
Just from like keeping the lights on, keeping the staff on the project to get it done, whatever it is,
mm-hmm,
right? Because that's, again, I don't know this for fact, but I'm pretty sure that most architecture firms have worked with these wealthier clients because that's how they make their firms run,
mm-hmm,
because that's their main stream of revenue. They have to charge these, the 10 to 15% on top of the projects
mm-hmm.
to maintain business. And
Yeah.
you can really only do that if you have an office full of like 50 people, an office of 15 people, whatever it is, if you work for these high end projects. So it's like, well, there's the expensive clients, which are very few. We call it like the 1% for a reason,
Mm-hmm,
versus the majority, right?
mm-hmm,
Imagine the majority of the population is now able to
mm-hmm,
buy architecture, quote unquote, services in
mm-hmm.
means of buying a house floor plan or a
Right.
product from them
Oh,
and
dude.
just
Also,
take that design and go with it.
that also makes me wonder about, like, how with the urban sprawl, that's like the most. They're like
Mm-hmm.
everyone's worried about the urban sprawl. Like if every single land was a one-story floor plan, right? Eventually, we'll run out of space in the entire Earth and like entire world. So that's what the worry about the urban sprawl is. Like there is too much, like we need to, instead of building or spreading horizontally, we need to spread vertically, and that's why like
Mm.
the urban sprawl was such a big factor in our school as well. Like I think there was a lot of people who were trying to figure out if that is something that we can fix. And that's just something, one of my worries too, when we're talking about just the residential part of architecture, and whether
Because
it
I
could be
think that might be more in the realm of like urban planners and stuff. I don't know if architects have a whole lot of control in how that
right.
works,
But
but
like
I don't know. I'd be surprised.
if people buy the land and we're like, this is in the future, like distant future, if all land has been bought and everyone wants a single family 1 story floor plan, how do we make sure that as architects, as designers, because there won't be enough space anymore, how do we like
Yeah,
how do we how why would they buy a product if they already have the product?
because you're saying like there'd be too many houses that there would be no reason to buy any more floor plans.
Yeah, so we'd either have to like destroy houses and then build new ones, or which could be really
Well,
nice, but
yeah, I guess that's also kind of the nice part about architecture as an industry and just a creative field is we also do renovation work. I don't know the percentage. This is where I was saying earlier, like we didn't come to play with statistics, but
mhm,
it's I'm pretty sure there's a great majority of people who hire architects to do renovation work or something. And like
mhm,
obviously there's people who hire contractors to do the same thing. But for people who can afford it, I'm more than certain they hire architects to figure out how to do it the right way or whatever.
mhm, yeah,
So it's I think like the good news and the bad news about architecture is we have a very broad brush. We can do almost everything out there, even that's not building related. You go into an architecture schooling program, you just learn how to think creatively, and you can use that to pretty much any field you want. There's so many people who go and graduate with architecture degrees, but do graphic design. There's so many people
yeah,
who do like other creative works that aren't even architecture related. So it's like, let's even pretend worst case scenario, God forbidding, the architecture industry does go kaputs. At least we know we have the creative thinking skills to look at these like AI generated designs and discernly point out why things are wrong
mhm,
and be able to do things better than a computer can. And
yeah,
here's the other thing that I think we should pivot into, which is I think a lot of the health and, reliability of the architecture industry actually falls down to relying on public opinion on architecture. And that's a lot to unpack. But essentially what I'm saying is anything in the world, the reason why you buy it is because it has value, right?
mhm,
People hire architects because of the value of their service is they get to have a really well designed house that looks
mhm,
beautiful, it's perfect, it fits all the bedrooms that they need, it and all this stuff, right?
mhm,
So usually people who have the money are willing to service that because it's like, oh yeah, the quote unquote value of architecture services is priced really high. I can afford that. So of course I'm gonna do it. But the person who's it's kind of like looking at like cars in a way too, just to tie a metaphor into this.
mhm.
There's you can have a car that's priced at $200 if you're buying a
Yeah,
really old junkie, or you can buy one that's $2 billion, right?
mhm,
And technically they're both the same thing.
yeah,
They
get you
both get you
from,
from point A to point B,
yep,
but obviously people value certain things more than others.
mhm,
If you're on the market for a car, you could easily afford something that was built from like 2013, but obviously it doesn't come with all the bells and whistles. It's
mhm,
not like the luxury brands that you probably want in your head. But if you see that there's like, it might be slightly out of your price range, but you still like the bells and whistles, the feeling of being driving around in that brand and being seen with the BMW key fob in your pocket, that
yeah,
also brings a little level of like, feels kind of good to rep a pretty reputable brand and stuff here and there. Like,
yeah,
they have a valuable asset that's priced a certain way.
mhm,
So I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say that people value things for semi arbitrary reasons and undervalue things for arbitrary reasons as well.
mhm,
How does this tie into architecture then? So the public opinion on architecture is like, depending on how people value it, I think comes a lot more to if you don't see the value in it, then you don't buy it. Like,
mhm.
for example, I don't care about diamonds. You can never sell me anything in the world. You could show me a billion advertisements. I would never purposely go out of my way to buy any diamond jewelry. I just don't care. But to other people, they would love to buy it because for some reason they find like that to be
It's
valuable to them.
shiny.
Yeah, it's
It
shiny. It's
blings.
yeah. So it's like when it comes to architecture, it's like how do we make architecture appealing to the general public, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does that become something that's valuable to them? And my argument for that, long-winded, is saying that I think a lot more people would appreciate hiring architects and hiring architecture services, or just buying architecture, if you will, for doing the
Mm-hmm.
product route, if it was in their price realm.
Mm-hmm.
But they simply can't afford it because that's all they've known. If you're not
Yeah.
a billionaire, you can't build your own house. If you're not
Yeah.
a billionaire, you can't like afford to build your like architecture, perfectly modern, whatever thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's just kind of like the public narrative. That's the public opinion on architecture, it seems.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot more other things we talked about in the last episode with Maria
Mm-hmm.
about like historical architecture styles versus modern architecture styles and how public appreciates and doesn't
Yeah.
appreciate certain styles. It's very complicated. But I think the biggest factor in all of this is how can we appeal to more people in the public to make architecture valuable to them, to make it worth keeping around in society,
I think
is
it has
what I'm
something to
trying to say.
do a little bit of awareness too. It's like if you're living in, like you said, the generic home for most of your life, and then you don't really understand what the value is to that, like that specific really well designed house, like the ones that we were talking about. Why would you ever go looking for that, right? Because
Right.
you're not aware of that. That's actually a thing, and so
Right.
if once you bring awareness to this situation, the more they will come to appreciate it. But it's also because it's really important to have, so like people, the reason why people, at least from my point of view, value so much the historical buildings of like the Renaissance, all these buildings, is because we're not building those anymore.
Hmm.
And
And there's
because
also a visceral feeling that comes with that stuff.
yeah, and what, because we're not building it anymore, it gives value that there's no one else that can build things like this, and so we have to keep this
You
safe.
appreciate it more.
Yes, we have to keep this safe, appreciate the with its whole like its whole thing, and because the generic houses can be built, we need to appreciate it as more. Like
Hmm.
it's so easy to just not appreciate it because it's so easy to build and very developer.
You were
But
just talking about something that I really want to touch on. It was most people, their experience of quote unquote architecture is built or growing up in their family home, right?
hmm hmm
Which is, as we've seen by statistics, more than likely not done by an architect. And
yeah,
if that's your general perspective of like, why do people give a crap about architects designing houses? Look how shitty the one is around us. It's like, well, that wasn't designed by an architect, man, was it?
yeah,
Or, you know, like an architecture firm. So
yeah,
it's like, it's hard to win this argument when you have a very slim percentage of people's daily experiences
hmm
to impact them with the power of architecture.
yep,
That's why I was thinking back to like when you're talking about the Renaissance stuff. Like when people go to visit this, people are taking billions of pictures. People are like, wow, this is
hmm
crazy, you know, because it's that visceral feeling that architecture can give people. You
hmm
can't price that really. People
yeah,
try to. It's a
yep,
lot.
yep, yeah,
But it's like there's something about just architecture itself, architectural design, that
hmm
just fundamentally impacts the visceral human experience.
hmm
And when you're going around these generic boxes that are constrained by developer budget constraints and
the
just, you know,
drywalls.
yeah, it's just like there's so many different factors that limit the power and the outreach that architecture can give to the normal person.
Yeah,
The best chance you have is with public buildings like libraries, stadiums, sometimes,
hmm
even just like, you know, malls or other just public program, right?
hmm
Those are like the very limited experiences that most people get to experience architecture. And
hmm
even then, most of those things are fundamentally constrained by budgetary constraints,
yeah,
and you can only go to certain extents with it. And like
yeah,
even it's kind of fun to think about it, like with Zaha Hadid's like the Maxi Museum, like this incredible like monumental piece of architecture, right?
hmm
You see this thing, you're like, wow, this was done by an architect for sure. But
yeah,
then you walk in and you can tell where all of the different kinds of compromises were made. You touch the handrails,
value
they're the most
engineering.
like cheap type, yeah, value engineered material possible. You touch
Yeah,
the wall, the hollowest thing possible. And like that's the effect. Like the
yeah,
architect's vision usually exceeds what the budget can allow to do,
Yeah.
and you have to find all these ways to
Hmm.
just wring out and water down like the true architecture, I guess, impact, if you
Yeah.
will,
You
when
made
all
me
these things get confined. So
you
yeah.
made me think about like how if you don't know how much these luxurious homes cost, you're always, because it looks nice, you're always thinking it's high value and super expensive. But
Mm,
the thing is, if you try to make these things like prefabricated modular housing, that makes the prices go way lower. But because it
mhm.
looks nice, you have this preconceived notion of this looks like it's so expensive, but in reality it might just cost the same amount as a developer home.
And we've been seeing this too. We were just researching a couple brands at the beginning of this episode. There's one called Cover who's been doing essentially, like, again, how I'm kind of picturing the industry to move towards if it's going to compete with these home builders and everything else, which is clients are able to a certain degree, customize on a modular system how they want their home to be. And at the end all price of it, for like 425 square feet or something, it was like 300 grand or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
which sounds crazy, but that's about the price of a normal
Yeah.
house today anyways, if
Yeah.
you're to do brand new construction.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, great architecture design, because the houses did look nice. I mean, Albert, you can
It
tell
does.
if
It
you wanted
looks
to do.
pretty nice.
Okay.
It's very it's
But
very
a
nice. It's
great
very
looking
nice.
design was at an affordable scale to the average American family or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
So that's to bring it kind of full circle, right? Is that what the goal is of architecture and architects? To impact people with great design, as many
Mm-hmm.
people as possible.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, again, that's, you guys can come to your own conclusions, but that's why I think this is kind of the direction the industry might have to go in order
Mm-hmm.
to be relevant, at least in the residential market. Because at least, again, with architects, we're kind of safe in the office towers and the big old giant project scale things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'd have to shift in this direction if you want to compete with the home builders, developer project code houses, because these houses, I was researching this too, as there's a thing called Mima house, which we'll probably put a link here as well. But these houses look so freaking nice, and I was looking at how much this productized architectural building would cost, and it looks like it costed about between like 20k euros to around 30k euros just to buy the like the plants and
Which
stuff
is
like
like
that.
30 to 40 or 50 grand
Yeah, and I
United
was
States dollars.
yeah, and it's I would, dude, these things look nice. You've seen them, right?
Yeah. And they look
These
good.
things, they look nice, but I'm not sure if the
And that one
pricing is
is done by
actually
an
nice.
architecture firm, right?
Yeah, it is. It's done by an architecture firm, and they built these houses already. And they just said, okay, what if we just make these houses that we have, um, be sold as products? And you go to their website, and basically their website looks like when you're buying a car. Like they're like, you can have a concrete house, you can have a wood house, you can have a mix, and this is how much it like. We'll look at it in a detailed phase, or we'll
Hmm.
look at a detailed. We'll look into the building footprint. We'll look into how it fits in the urban site. And it was just like, dang, that looks nice.
Yeah.
And you can choose what shape: a U shape, an L shape, just a straight line. It's pretty nice, and it's prefabricated, and that's what their whole thing is. That since it's prefabricated and it works under a grid, it's so easy to build and so easy to buy these certain materials because of it.
Yeah. Okay. And then after hearing all this, the first thing I'm starting to think about is, what does that even mean for studio? What does that even mean for learning architecture, like going to architecture school? Like, if I'm a second year, am I screwed then? Like, what can I take away from this? And I wanted to touch on some potential ideas that, we can kind of just toss around here. And part of me is wondering, like, let's jump forward a little bit more. Let's say you're like a new grad, or you're someone who is considering wanting to start your own practice. I'm genuinely starting to think that the right, or maybe just a more profitable way, might even be to start to incorporate this new or hybridized model of an architecture firm now, where
Mm-hmm.
it's you have your services for the clients who want to come in with like a $5 million budget or something, and you can totally do that. But
Mm-hmm.
then maybe you also hire some service or hire some staff to just generate a couple floor plans and maybe just create like a SketchUp model to take some rendering stuff here and there. So
Mm-hmm.
you can offer a house just off the shelf to somebody if they want to buy it, right?
That
Because
sounds
then
so
that can just
crazy to
act as like
hear.
supplemental income.
That sounds so like revolutionary. It's like you can just buy this thing that's off the shelf over here at a much cheaper price, even though it
Hmm.
looks really nice. That sounds like a that sounds like so unbelievable.
Because let me like, well, let's look at this too. I think for our generation, it's going to be extremely difficult for us to buy an existing house on the market nowadays, let
Mm-hmm.
alone even pretend that we're going to do stick or like brand new construction of the same size, same quality, same whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think more and more as we're looking at the industry trends, it's looking more towards these prefabricated units that you just buy that are like essentially tiny homes or micro homes that you can buy for under 200 grand, under 100 grand, whatever it is. So it's kind of one of those things where architecture, I think, just it's always evolving, right? We just might be at the point where we're witnessing this change. And
Mm-hmm.
like many things, like with the AI wave, it's like the people who choose to accept this and try to figure out how to work within it and use it to their benefit are going to probably rise to the top. And the ones who refuse and say, oh, there's no way we're going to do something like this. Architecture stood for 1,000 years and will stand for 1,000 more and whatever. And who knows what's going to happen, right? It's just
Yeah.
like speculative thinking. But it's just, you can only look at the trends and make up your mind for yourself.
Yeah.
So then that's why I'm wanting to get back to like, again, the second year. What did they do? Like, what do you think that is going on in their heads right now?
Right. I if I were them, I'd in my head I would be worried about if we are going to start to productize these things, right? Will I still have a job? Will I still have a job when I graduate? And I think you still do have a job. I was wondering too, is that once you do productize this thing, do you do like a royalty thing so that every time you buy it,
Mm.
it's like you or maybe not a royalty thing, but
Kind of
like
like furniture designs. Like you can
yeah,
sell the rights to your chair to
yeah,
a furniture brand or something
yeah,
like IKEA. And then
yeah,
they give you royalties based off of how many they sell or something.
yeah, something like
That
that
could also be the case.
where it's like you designed part of this floor plan, so you should also take percentage of how much, like when this floor plan sells, you should also get a percentage of that money as well. That like I'm starting to wonder if that's the shift. Maybe we shift into this productized architecture, but then we do like a percentage of like when a set of drawings are sold, we get percentage of that back as a designer who would design part of them.
Because that would happen more for like the home builders specifically. Because I don't know if it works that way if you're at a firm. Because if you're a firm, you're a collective. Your work is the firm's work.
Mm-hmm.
So if you sell a floor plan, the firm sold the floor plan, not
Yeah,
you.
yeah,
So it's that gets harder.
yeah.
But it might even bring up for the idea that many people, we might be looking at an era where almost everything is kind of just the private practice,
Mm-hmm.
where everyone almost owns their own small architecture firm business or something too. And
Mm-hmm.
that, I don't even want to get into that because that sounds like it could be its whole other episode or something. But
Yeah.
one more time, just to iterate on like, what can you do if you're still in school? Again, I think we might have been preaching this a few times already now, but truly just prioritizing learning these new age skills is going to be your best bet at anything. If you are a person who's refusing to learn AI, it's going to be a lot more difficult in 10 years from now, 15 years from now to
Mm-hmm.
even be competitive. It's kind of like the person who refuses to learn Revit or something. It's like, I don't know what to tell you. Every firm in the world uses Revit. So it's like,
Yeah.
if you're going to purposely choose to ignore it, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot here.
Yeah.
And the same goes for, I would add on to that by saying, if you can start to learn business skills and marketing skills, you're probably also going to need a lot more of those once the AI age becomes increasingly more relevant in these architecture
Mm-hmm.
industries. Because pretty soon, like I was saying earlier, I think you're going to see a bigger growth in just independent practices where people are going to say, forget working at this firm. I want to open up my own practice because now I have AI on my hands so I can do things faster with less people or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are going to start doing their own houses, and everyone's going to pretty much have like what we were saying earlier, like the car brand approach.
Yeah.
Are you going to buy a Mazda house? Or are you going to buy a Toyota house? Are you going to
Yeah.
buy a Renzo Piano office house? Are you going to buy a Zaha Hadid home?
Yeah. This is a really interesting this is this is a really interesting like thought experiment. And I think that in terms of what they can do, definitely like you see like a year ago, AI, or was it a year or two ago, AI wasn't really a big thing, but now everyone's using it. And
Everyone.
so like you need to look at these trends that are happening and jump on board and see how you can use that to your advantage and
Mm-hmm.
not just be like, oh, that's just how it is. And so like you need to think more
Because
proactively
that's
in
how you
how that
get
works.
endangered with like your career or anything in life. If you just are sitting passively on the sidelines and waiting for things to happen, it I don't know what to say. Like we're at that point in life where you can't really do that anymore.
Yeah.
Like you have to be proactive. You have to actively pursue what your goals are in life. You have
Hmm.
to go out of your way to make some uncomfortable sacrifices sometimes to make sure that you're learning these new age skills so you can stay relevant in the business, because
Hmm.
it's only a matter of time before offices are going to mandate that you know AI or no Dali or no Midjourney, just like they mandate AutoCAD, Revit, SketchUp, Rhino,
Hmm.
that kind of stuff.
Even Lumion
So
or Enscape, just in
yeah,
general for easy visualizations.
so it's just like we need to be active in our education now. We can't
Hmm.
wait for architecture schools to serve us. We have to find ways to increase our own learning.
Yeah, because if you think about it, like if we go outside of architecture, right? Back then when internet did not happen, in order for people to send something to another place, like a letter, they'd have to write a letter and envelope, write down where it's from or who it's from, and send it right. But now all these documents that are typically going to be sent over mail are now sent through emails. And so now all these skills that you learned back then of how to called
And cursive and all this other stuff, yeah,
yeah, now
are outdated.
it's just outdated now. It's like the world is moving in a rapid pace. And back then, like even now, okay, so think about the gaming scene. Back then they didn't have esports. But now it's such a big thing where like they're treating like you
Lots
go
of
to
universities are starting to put in esports teams.
yeah, and you go to B Dubs or something, and usually they would have football games, soccer games, basketball games up there. But now when you sit up there, they're they're showing esports like League of Legends, Valorant up there, and it's like wow, the time has changed, and we need to keep learning in order to be relevant within our own field.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we think we should talk about on this topic, whether it comes to like the product system or critiquing some of the ways that the academia is preparing us for it or whatever?
I don't think we talk about the productizing architecture as a like we talk too much about architecture as a service rather than as a product. It'd be interesting to have a seminar in like universities where or architecture school universities where they're talking about this new quote unquote new age where
Mm-hmm.
it's more prominent in residential architecture, but it'd be interesting to have this type of seminar where they're trying to figure out if there's a way moving forward with this.
Yeah. And I will say, too, just to give universities a fair shot here, I think many universities are starting to get a lot better, are starting to pay a lot more attention to the current day trends, the modern technologies that students need to be learning and stuff. Again, the AI course did not exist when Albert and I were there, but I guess there's an AI course at K
Yep.
State now
Yep.
that some people that I've been talking to are taking and are learning quite a bit from. So
Hmm.
like we missed out on that. So now we have to, as graduates, now we have to be on our own responsibility to learn this stuff. So that way, again, because our office isn't going to force us to learn this, we
Hmm.
have to actively tell ourselves to learn this.
Yeah. Yep, we can't stay boomers. We have to.
We can't be asking people how to open PowerPoints and
Yeah, and I think that's why there's a lot of like professionals out there that they're going through training, because to them that's like what they're being taught, with what we're being taught in school, right? Like we're being taught how to use AI, how to use all these different things in school, but when you're in the workforce you don't necessarily get that, and that's why some professionals take training courses so that they can
Mhm.
keep themselves updated within the whole industry.
Yeah. I think we start to wrap this up then. Talk about our takeaways.
I would say
Sure, sure,
that
sure.
the first thing I would say is that now that you're aware of this, right, look into the different firms that are doing this. So Ryan mentioned Cover. I'm gonna mention Mima Housing. I'm also going to mention this one thing that's called Workspace.fi. It's a Finnish firm, I think. It's a Finnish firm, and majority of their, I think, product based architecture is more geared towards a certain niche, which is their office space. And so a lot of these designs that they're trying to do is for office spaces. And so check out Mima Housing, Workspace.fi. These are, you will see that like it feels like sometimes European firms are more innovative in terms of how they see architecture, and so a lot of these. So the Finnish firm is in, you know, in Europe, and then Mima Housing, it's in Portugal, I believe. So check them out. They got awarded with the residential award from Arc Daily back in 2011, I believe. So really
Yeah.
cool designs.
No, for real. Um, I think then for my final takes or final takeaways, I will say very similar to Albert. Like now that you're aware of this issue, we're not trying to like fearmonger. We're not trying to claim that industries are going to do something when they're not. We're not trying to say that this is for sure happening or anything else. We saw this episode, we're reacting to it, and we think there's a lot of validity to it. And again, you're free to make your own decisions off of that too and your own conclusions. But what I think is for certain is the only constant in life is change. And if you are a person who is not training yourself to be adaptable, not training yourself to be as self teaching or wanting to learn things on your own, you're going to be struggling a lot more nowadays than I think you would before a lot of these new things were introduced. So it's just a matter of like, understand these things and try and find something that's really fascinating to you about it so that you are motivated to really want to understand it and work towards it. And again, you guys in school right now, as cliche as it sounds, you are the future of the architecture
Mm-hmm.
industry. So if you are finding something about this whole topic that's really interesting, you very likely could be another source of direction in how this industry moves.
Mm-hmm.
And the old dinosaur firms that are stuck in their ways, they might completely phase out. The ones who are right now, who are actively trying to adjust and pivot to different things,
Mm-hmm.
will probably find their realm somewhere in the middle of all this stuff.
Yeah.
But then you guys are just recently graduating and stuff. You have the most potential to literally do whatever you want in the industry and possibly influence how things move. So, if anything, instead of being scared about this, I see this as an absolute win. No, I see this as like a really cool opportunity and a really cool moment in architecture where we are witnessing things changing. You
Mm-hmm.
see this in history of the time where like you see between the 1950s and the 1960s, it was this era. Not realizing that every single decade we're in a history book in the
Mm-hmm.
future, you know?
Yep.
Whatever's happening now, people are going to read back and see these pivoting moments and say, "Oh, that was the AI and architecture period right there."
Yeah. That
And you
would.
know, like
You just made me think about like how like back in the father of modernism, the Corbusier. No one knew about him until like that specific Villa
Villa Savoy.
Savoy. Yeah, and then now he's like a household name in the architecture. Like I am thinking that the people who are listening could become this person that everyone looks towards because they had this specific expertise
Yeah.
that they pursued.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty clean way to round up this episode. Very interesting conversation. I had a lot of fun talking about it. I don't know if you had a lot of, yeah.
That was pretty fun.
We want to, like, seriously, if you want to know what you guys think of this topic, we just like to bring it up to see how people feel about it and what you guys are seeing at your own schools. In fact, like, please tell us from your other schools what you guys are doing in your own studies and everything. The whole point of the Crit Room, moving into our next season and everything too, is we're trying to get as many different voices, as many different perspectives as possible from the architecture community to influence and to inspire, to inform everyone about what's going on in architecture around the world. Because ironically, even though we're as connected as we've ever or possibly been in history, we're also in so many different pockets, and it gets easy to forget that other people exist out there. So tell us what you think, tell us what you hate, tell us what you love. And if you want to see another episode, we'll have one linked on the end screen here, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Bye. Don't forget to save.
Don't forget to save.
Bye.